Good morning. Welcome to my neighborhood. I want to ask some questions about human nature today, because I really don't know the answers. There was a posting of a sign on a bus, you know, those kind that go up along the corners of the ceiling and the wall of the bus. And it said, if you're reading this sign and not looking at your phone, you're different. And it's very funny because everybody is different. And yet we have this push-pull about being unique. We like that, but not too much. Because if you're too unique, well, you stick out. And in Japan, they say, you know, if the nail sticks up, you hammer it down. Today's an interesting day. There's a whole bunch of things going on. And I'm noticing that a year ago, they would have been covered in the media. Not now. We have a volcanic eruption in Sicily that's raining rocks. We have some quite big earthquakes kicking around, and there was one a week or so ago in Fukushima that was 7 point something that did some additional damage around that nuclear reactor where we had the really big one a while back. In the Loyalty Islands in mid-Pacific, well, not mid-Pacific, South Pacific, there's been quite a series of earthquakes in excess of 7 on the Richter scale. And there are reports from Iceland that the rapid and increasingly severe earthquake activity may lead to volcanic eruptions there also. There was also a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, I think. Is it Indonesia? Yeah, I think so. Yesterday. So I'm kind of going, well, is this really unusual? Or is this just kind of par for the course? And in some respects it's normal, and in other respects maybe not. But the point here is that when we get earthquakes and volcanoes around populated centers, normally the media goes all nuts about it. And we hear about it and we talk about it. Not the case. Nobody's talking about this stuff. Not on broadcast media, anyway. We had this thing go on in Australia, where the Australian government said that Facebook and others, like Google, shall pay the people that write the news. Well, more likely, the organizations that publish the news, like Murdoch Corp and things like that. It's Australia, after all. But Facebook said, hey, you know, we are doing deals with news organizations and we do value them, but we're actually providing them a service which they are happily partaking of to get their information out and people back to their websites and all that kind of stuff. And less are people reading websites. Recently what they've done is they've made deals with the news corporations so the government doesn't have to legislate. Now this is interesting because it's happening in Canada too. I think the bill is C-10. And they're going, oh well, you know, you have to pay. But there's 3 things that media organizations do. They have a distribution medium. Television, radio, print, and now internet, of course, for all of the above. They produce, that is, they do the production, the video, the sound, the layout, and I guess part of that is going to be the content of it, right? Like what do we put in these things? And then we have writers and script writers, and all those parts, storyboard people that contribute to that, and researchers. But they're saying that, I guess in between that, there's a level of curation. So you've got the physical distribution, you've got the production, you've got the curation of what goes together to make the brand, make the sense of the stories, make all the pieces kind of flow. And then you've got the people that build the individual pieces. If we think about a newspaper, writers. So the argument was that the writers weren't getting compensated enough. And I'm not sure the writers ever get compensated enough. But one of the reasons why newspapers have been going down in terms of the revenues isn't because the writers are doing a less good job. They're often doing a very good job. The journalists, investigative journalists. But it's because there's other people on the net that are doing the same thing and using things like Facebook, YouTube, and many other distribution facilities, and doing a similar job, sometimes better. So when we're looking at two aspects, or three, if you think about the production too, you've got the production, you've got the curation, and you've got the research required to build the stories, all of which are valid, creative kind of things. But in this deal that Facebook has done with the news organizations, and I don't pretend to know what the deal is, I don't think it includes people like you and me that regularly do research, don't just copy other people's stuff. We go after stuff, we dig, we do vertical spikes of research, and we put together stories. Now, we often use research papers and sometimes summaries of them or articles about them as pivots for the stories. But for years, I've had other media producers mine the research I do without credit. Occasionally, they'll say, oh yeah, on my web page for a radio broadcaster, I'll put a credit. I'll give you credit because you came up with the idea and put the story together, and I just went and interviewed the people, and that's valid. You should get credit too. But they will never, or very rarely, acknowledge where the story came from on their medium of broadcast. So this is interesting because with the deal between Facebook and the megacorps, News Corps and stuff like that, it leaves out all the content creators on Facebook, potentially YouTube, Google, and everything else, in deference to paying the people that have the lawyers and the lobbyists that can go after this. So I'm not about making journalism go away, but there's something a little fishy about this whole thing. Yesterday, excuse me, yesterday, I was walking out of the park and I bumped into somebody. And it's funny, this business of how we like to think about things and how once we get an understanding, at some level it goes deep. Everybody's bumped into people in this pandemic that don't believe in it. But the thing that still startles me is the almost absolute continuity of the arguments. And I don't mean to propagate them, but just in summary, it says I don't trust government, so I don't trust science. The COVID is no worse than the flu because excess deaths. And then it goes on. But in that short narration, there is a huge amount of I'm not going to learn. I'm not going to go look. I'm not going to understand. And normally I wouldn't worry too much about that. It happens all the time. But it means that their behavior is such that they're not going to follow protocols. Somebody was saying that they went into a local brewery and they have very small tables. And in pubs, you're allowed to have 6 people around a table. Well, if you've got a table that normally seats 3 and you put 6 people around it, or 4, they're pretty close. And of course, because they're eating and drinking, they don't have to wear a mask. So just wondering where our understandings come from. You know, are we do have media concentrations where some people just like watching media that will cater to their opinions, to the ideas that they may have already, and reject everything else. I mean, I've had people tell me that they don't listen to CBC because, you know, it's just too liberal. Nah. And yet, there's a lot of information on a lot of medium. And you can get a good story coming up on a bad medium. You can get bad stories coming up on a good medium. It's like, happens. But when we get people kind of locked into a mindset that then causes ongoing devastation. For instance, yesterday, the governor of Texas and the governor of Missouri said, hey, next week, all businesses can open, 100%. Mandatory masks, don't need them anymore. Now, there is a lot of COVID spread still in Texas. I think they had something like 13% of the population that have got the vaccine. Something similar in Missouri. There wasn't necessarily really great masking going on there either in the pubs and stuff in the first place. So where does this take us? I mean, this is about human nature, how we get information. Remember that bus sign we started with? You're different if you're reading this sign and not looking at your phone. The other thing that's happening today that's not being reported on is a Starship is being launched. A launch attempt. We'll see if it goes. And it's going up something like 12.5 kilometers. It's leaning forward, belly down, and dropping, practicing re-entry maneuvers with little flaps to control it, little jets of material coming out the sides to control it. And just before it lands, it's still moving at quite a phenomenal speed, it tips itself up and theoretically lands on its tail. Now, this is no small rocket. This is 9 meters across and 50 meters tall, and this is just the top part without the booster for orbital insertion. They've done this twice before. Both times there was unscheduled disassembly at the launch pad, but it was otherwise pretty perfect. And the amazing thing is that they got into the center of the launch pad both times too. So they're going to try again. And just to put this in perspective, SpaceX regularly lands boosters on things like moving barges in the middle of the Atlantic. Well, 300 miles out into the Atlantic anyway. And they do this with an amazing regularity and precision. This is a different aircraft with different engines, different fuels, and completely different configuration of landing because it's not coming down tail first, it's coming down belly first to reduce speed without using fuel. So I was checking live streams of this morning, and typically when you have this, you get about 250,000 people watching from around the world, from everywhere around the world. Not news. You haven't heard about it in your papers or on the radio, usually. Music is news, awards are news. So again, what do we aggregate? What do we understand? How do we understand it? It seems that once we learn something in a particular state, it goes deep and it becomes like a first-hand experience. Must be some kind of adaptive response. There was an experiment done some years ago, I believe in Australia, where they were generating a particularly periodic magnetic field. I think it was in your left temple. They put a football helmet on your head. And they told people what would happen, and what they were sort of surprised at originally and why they were doing this test is that people saw apparitions when they did this. And more than that, they saw mostly something they interpreted as a representation of God. And I think it was an All in the Mind podcast a while back that interviewed a journalist who was the daughter of a preacher and had grown up in a very religious household, but was not, at this point, religious at all. So they wondered what she would see. And I should add that even though people knew what was going on, they knew that this would induce, them seeing something that wasn't there. People were profoundly moved and changed as a result of this experiment. So the woman who was doing the reporting, what she saw was Golem. Not sure why, but evidently it triggers some kind of visual thing and you're going to see something. So the takeaway with this one is that when you associate a particular mind state with a particular set of experiences, they become, if not indelible, a direct experience. So finally, there's an ideas program on SCBC Ideas a couple of days ago, March 1st, I think. And it was about the evolution of dogs. A lot of people are adopting dogs, puppies. When they're being isolated, they're at home, they can take care of them, they can walk them. The dogs walk the people, that is. And they started with wolves. And they've got evidence from Germany, burials and that kind of thing, where dogs were being treated as part of the community 15,000 years ago. Doesn't seem very long ago. So it could well be far earlier, but we just don't have the evidence for it. But the thing that jumped out at me in this context was, and it's a very good show, it's worth listening to. The thing that jumped out was the major difference we see between dogs and wolves is that wolves get along. The wolves cooperate intrinsically. Dogs don't. Dogs may cooperate with you. They may take lead from you. But much less cooperation. This is what the experts are saying, who have raised 42 wolf pups or something. They're saying that the wolves intrinsically cooperate, but the domesticated animals, not so much. So the thought I'm going to leave you with today is, what happens if we substitute the word dog in that documentary with human, people? Are we less inclined to cooperate with each other now? And why? Have we domesticated ourselves to an extent that we've broken a lot of our adaptive responses? We'll talk about adaptive responses some other time. What does prolonged isolation and prolonged stress do to that particular adaptive response? So, looks like my batteries run out somehow on this device. So, I'll wish you a good day. And again, I'm very grateful for the thoughts that people have. Talk to me. Push like, share down below. And we'll see you again soon. Bye now.